Obsidian is one of my favorite episodes of Adventure Time. Bonnie and Marcy-centric episodes tend to be more lore-heavy and character-driven, and this episode is no exception to that. As a Distant Lands episode that focuses on these two characters, it puts on full display why people love Adventure Time, having two amazing songs, emotional moments, and explaining the lore behind the past relationship of these two fan-favorite characters. I want to break down these aspects of the episode and why it's one of my favorite episodes. Let's get into it. Marceline throughout the entirety of Adventure Time has been a fan favorite, and what makes her a fan favorite character, at least partially, is the depth of her character. And this episode cashes in on two things we didn't understand about Marceline's character by Come Along With Me. Those being what happened between Bonnie and Marcy to cause them to break up, as well as fleshing out Marceline's relationship with her mom, giving some understanding as to why we don't get much mention of her in the main run of the series, and only saw her in the Everything Stays flashback, which, by the way, still a really good song, but that's just a bit of a side note. Getting more information about Marceline's family situation, this time coming from her mother, offers another depressing layer to her issues with parental figures. She has a crappy father, a mother who passed when she was too young to understand any of it and thought she was abandoned, and the everything involving Simon, with her finally having a semi-stable parental figure in her life who abandoned her in order to keep her safe. Which then leads to the disconnect between her and Bonnie their first time around being together. Because if you don't get along with authority, you're gonna hate Princess Bubblegum. They started out as a cute couple, and at the end of the episode, we see that Bonnie was initially a fan of Marceline, and the shirt that was stolen and what was missing, and that she eventually had to give up to Maja, was from a Marceline concert. They would eventually break up when Marceline performs one of the two bangers of this episode, Woke Up, where she lets out all of her issues with Bonnibel Bubblegum to her adoring crowd. They go their separate ways, and the next time they see each other is when we see them in the main show, at least from my understanding. Two of the more complex characters being the focus and going through their shared history after their reconciliation to bury the hatchet for good so that they can move forward with their relationship is what makes this episode so great. I think most Adventure Time fans can agree that most of the amazing songs that come out of this show are sung by Marceline, and she added two more to her catalog in this episode with Woke Up and Monster. On top of being really good songs sung by Olivia Olson, what makes these songs work so well in this episode is that they convey Marceline's mentality at different points in her life. After all the stuff she's gone through before and during the main series, and her developing her relationships and mending past relationships, Obsidian is the culmination of her development and displays the character she is at the end of it all. They are both emotionally charged songs but convey two very different emotional states. Woke Up shows a younger Marceline's aggression and anger. It's her letting out all of her frustration at PB, and probably some of her trauma unrelated to her and just laying into her. Whereas Monster shows a more soft-hearted Marceline who got to reconcile with Bonnie, reconnect with Simon, becomes friends, practically family with Finn and Jake, understands the truth about her mom, and has learned to properly convey her emotions and not see them as weaknesses. I think it's worthwhile to draw this comparison. Something Adventure Time and Steven Universe have in common is that they both are shows that know how to use music to convey emotions, as well as display aspects of a character that would be harder to convey, and they are able to do it in such a raw way, showing every aspect of the character and their development, as well as just where they are in that moment mentally. Monster is a good example of this from Adventure Time, whereas for Steven Universe, I'd say Here Comes a Thought also does a really good job at this. I think it's also worth noting that Marceline didn't want to sing Woke Up the second time around, and because there was no real emotion behind it, it didn't work like it did the first time. But when she sang Monster, it inspired an evolution in the monster, making it more friendly. So far, I've mostly focused on Marceline in this episode, because she was still the primary focus of this episode, and is the third most fleshed out character in this series after Finn and Simon. But this episode also serves as a conclusion to Bonnie's character, and that's still worth talking about. Looking at where Bonnie's character starts and where it concludes in Obsidian is like looking at two very different characters. And there's a reason for that. She was initially not supposed to be this deep of a character in seasons 1 and 2, but by the finale and Obsidian, she is one of the more complex and fleshed out characters in a show with a good number of developed, fleshed out, and complex characters. When we see Bonnie interact with Marceline in the earlier seasons, especially in What Was Missing, we can tell that these two had a history, and while it would later be revealed to be a romantic relationship, it was absolutely not planned to be that at the time, but it definitely worked out in that way, and I like how it was written, and how these two over time mend their broken bond. Bonnie needing to learn that she can't be in charge of everything, learning to lean on others and accept support and just relax was a huge part of her character throughout Adventure Time, and the only character that could really inspire these developments in her is someone who has as much life experience as her, and who has seen her for who she truly is. The character who got the most honest version of Bonnie was Marceline. It wasn't something Finn could do because he'll always just be her little brother figure or her little hero, but Marceline is her ex and current who knows her better than anyone else. By Come Along With Me, Bonnie is, for the most part, a fully developed character. She's a tyrant, sure, but she is at least willing to hear people out for a moment before going full tyrant mode. When we see her in Obsidian, she's more laid back since then, and why she's not as up her own ass as she was in the original series is because she spent so much time with Marceline since then. At the end of Come Along With Me, we see that they move in together, and at the beginning of this episode, we see that they don't really leave each other's side, which, if my deduction is true, that means Marceline has plenty of time to rub off on PB. She does fall into old habits, as we see throughout this episode, but it isn't to the extent that we've seen PB reach in the past, but those old habits do peak out every now and then. Since she developed throughout the show, she was in a better mental state to reciprocate Marceline's feelings and pay better attention to her, and after Marceline sang Monster, she kissed her and was fine just getting cooked in a volcano because that would mean she would be going with Marceline. To close this out, I want to say this episode encapsulates so many of the things that makes this show so memorable for so many of us. The episodes that focus on character building and lore tend to be the ones that I find to be the best in any show, and this episode is a culmination of development for two of the more complex characters in a show full of complex characters. This episode served as a perfect ending to both of their character arcs. When we see them in Fiona and Cake, they seem to be on better terms than ever, and are just having fun getting tattoos together. And a side note, that scene explains why Marceline doesn't have a bunch of tattoos. I say this in pretty much every video I make about Adventure Time, but this show really is one of my favorites to ever exist. Seeing these characters grow since the night of the series premiere all the way up until I was a teenager when it ended, and even now in my 20s with Fiona and Cake, it always just brings me back to watching it back in elementary school, and I'll always have a pull toward this show. I will probably be making a similar video about Together Again, which I consider the true ending to Adventure Time with Finn and Jake, as well as it being another one of my favorite episodes, but that one is probably going to be quite a bit longer than this one. So stay tuned for that, because it will be fun. If you like this video, I'd encourage you to check out some more content, and if you like the other content, please do subscribe. Have a nice day, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take care, everybody.